Jake barely had time to sip his morning coffee when he heard the unmistakable screech of a furious woman outside his window. He looked up just in time to see Karen, his self-appointed nemesis, standing in his backyard, pointing at the ground as if she had just discovered a buried treasure. She was in her usual battle stance, hands on her hips, nostrils flaring like a bull about to charge. "You think you can just put a fence up without my permission?" she hollered, her voice cutting through the peaceful morning air like a rusty saw. Jake blinked. He wasn't sure what was more shocking, the fact that she was standing on his property, or that she actually believed she had a say in what he did with it. "I don't need your permission, Karen," he said, setting his coffee down. "This is my land." Karen's face twisted into a look of pure indignation, as if he had just committed an unforgivable crime. "That's where you're wrong, Jake." She spat his name like it was an insult. "This land has always been mine. The previous owner let me use it for years. Just because you bought the house doesn't mean you can take what isn't yours." Jake rubbed his temples. He had only lived here for a week and already he was questioning his life choices. He had dreamed of owning a peaceful suburban home with a big backyard, but apparently he had also unknowingly purchased a front-row ticket to the most absurd territorial dispute in history. "You do realize I have the property documents, right?" he said. "Like, official legal proof that this land is mine?" Karen waved a dismissive hand. "Documents can be wrong," she said. "But history? History says otherwise. I've been using this land for years and I'm not about to stop now." Jake stared at her, waiting for some hint that she was joking. She wasn't. This woman was actually trying to rewrite reality based on her feelings. "Karen, you can't just claim someone else's property because you're emotionally attached to it," he said. "Oh, but I can," she countered with a smirk. "And I will." With that, she turned on her heel and stomped off, leaving Jake standing there, mouth slightly open in disbelief. The next day, he woke up to find a brand new sign planted right in the middle of his backyard. In bold, capital letters it read, "Private property and no trespassing." Jake burst out laughing. "This woman actually thinks she can evict me from my own yard." He marched straight to Karen's house and knocked on her door. The second she opened it, she was already rolling her eyes. "Morning, Karen," he said, forcing a polite smile. "Mind explaining why there's a sign in my backyard claiming it's your property?" Karen crossed her arms. "I don't see the problem. That land belongs to me. I'm just making it official." Jake let out a slow breath. "Let me make something official. If you don't remove that sign, I will." Karen smirked. "Oh, you won't have to. The HOA will handle it." Jake blinked. "HOA? Yes," Karen said smugly. "I've already reported you. They'll be by soon to straighten this mess out." Jake frowned. Something about the way she said it didn't sit right with him. So later that day he did some digging, and what he found made him laugh so hard he nearly choked. There was no HOA. It had been dissolved years ago. Karen wasn't just acting like she owned the neighborhood. She had been pretending to run an entire organization that didn't even exist anymore. Armed with this newfound information, Jake returned to Karen's house that evening. "Hey Karen," he said, holding up his phone. "So, funny story, I checked the county records. Turns out the HOA was dissolved 5 years ago. Meaning you don't actually have any power. At all." For the first time, Karen's confident smirk faltered. That's just technicalities," she stammered. "The spirit of the HOA still exists. The community follows the rules and I am the one who enforces them." Jake stared at her in disbelief. "You enforce them? Karen, you're literally making up rules as you go." "Someone has to keep order," she snapped. "Order?" Jake scoffed. "You stole my backyard, put up a fake sign, and now you're pretending to run a non-existent HOA. That's not order, Karen. That's delusion." Karen gasped as if he had just insulted her entire lineage. "You have no respect for tradition," she said. "I knew you'd be trouble the moment you moved in." Jake pinched the bridge of his nose. He had dealt with difficult people before, but Karen was in a league of her own. "Let me make this clear," he said. "That land is mine. You're not using it. Take your stuff off my property or I will." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't dare." "Oh, I absolutely would." And he did. That night, under the cover of darkness, Jake removed Karen's sign and her ridiculous lawn chairs. He half expected her to call the police, but instead she doubled down. The next morning she was back in his yard, this time with a full-blown garden set. Table, chairs, even a decorative potted plant. Jake stood at his window, watching in disbelief as Karen hosted a book club meeting in his backyard. That was it. He was done playing nice. That night he started looking into fencing options. Not just any fence. A fence that would ensure Karen never set foot on his land again. And then he found it. The perfect solution. An electric fence. Low voltage. Completely legal. Just enough of a shock to keep certain people out. Jake grinned to himself. If Karen thought she could claim his land as hers, she was in for a shocking surprise. Jake spent the next few days planning his move carefully. He didn't want any loopholes that Karen could exploit, no way for her to manipulate the situation and cry victim. He researched everything he needed to know about electric fences, ensuring that what he was installing was perfectly legal. Low voltage, safe but effective, just enough of a deterrent to keep nosy trespassers out. The best part? It didn't even need to be visibly intimidating, just functional. The morning he installed it, he whistled to himself, feeling a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced since moving in. The fence blended seamlessly with his backyard, but the real beauty was the deterrent factor. The second someone touched it, they'd get a little zap. Nothing harmful, but just enough to make them think twice. By late afternoon, the moment of truth arrived. As expected, Karen strutted into his backyard like she was the rightful owner. She didn't knock. She didn't ask permission. She walked right in, same as always, heading toward her usual spot where she had been setting up her ridiculous outdoor seating. She carried a folded lawn chair in one hand and a smug expression on her face. Jake watched from his window, sipping his drink like an audience member waiting for the climax of a movie. Karen reached for the latch on his fence, completely oblivious. The moment her fingers touched the metal, she let out the most dramatic yelp he had ever heard in his life. She flailed backward, flinging her chair in the air as if she had just been struck by lightning. Jake nearly spit out his drink. Karen stumbled, her hands hovering in the air as if she was afraid to touch anything else. She blinked rapidly, then turned in a full circle as if she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Then she did exactly what he expected her to do. She went into full theatrics. Assault. He electrocuted me, she screamed at the top of her lungs, spinning toward the street. Help. Someone call the police. I've been attacked. Jake could barely contain his laughter as he stepped outside. Karen, are you seriously trying to claim I attacked you? You walked onto my property and grabbed my fence. She turned on him with wild eyes. That thing is a death trap. You could have killed me. Jake crossed his arms. Pretty sure you're still alive. Karen scowled, rubbing her hand like she had just survived some tragic ordeal. This is illegal. I'm reporting you. You can't just electrocute people. Jake sighed. It's a legal low-voltage fence, Karen. Installed perfectly within regulations. You know, to keep trespassers out. She sputtered, her face cycling through a series of expressions as she tried to find a way to turn this in her favor. Then like clockwork she pulled out her phone. That's it. I'm calling the police. Jake leaned against the fence and gestured toward her phone. Go ahead. Karen hesitated, her fingers hovering over the screen. Something in her expression shifted, as if she realized she didn't actually have a case. But instead of backing down, she did what Karen did best, she doubled down. 15 minutes later, a police car pulled up in front of their houses. Jake remained calm while Karen practically launched herself at the officer, waving her arms in exaggerated distress. He electrocuted me, she shouted. He set up a dangerous fence. I want him arrested. The officer looked at her, then at Jake, then at the fence. Ma'am, are you saying you trespassed onto his property and touched his fence? Karen blinked. It's not trespassing. That's my land. The officer sighed. Do you have any proof that this land belongs to you? Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. She turned to Jake, then back to the officer. The previous owner let me use it. That means it's mine. The officer gave her a blank stare. That's not how property ownership works. Jake couldn't help but grin. I have the property documents, officer. Would you like to see them? Karen let out a strangled noise as the officer nodded. Within minutes, Jake had presented every legal document proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the land was his. The officer barely glanced at them before turning back to Karen. Ma'am, he's well within his rights to install a fence on his own property, the officer said. If you trespassed and got shocked, that's on you. Karen's face turned beet red. This is outrageous, she hissed. You're supposed to protect people from... From what? The officer interrupted. Private property owners defending their land? Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. She was cornered and she knew it. But instead of admitting defeat, she let out a dramatic huff. Fine. But this isn't over. Jake watched as she stormed off, muttering to herself like a cartoon villain retreating to plot her next scheme. The officer gave him a knowing look before shaking his head and walking back to his car. Jake had won the battle, but he knew the war wasn't over. Karen was the type of person who couldn't stand being proven wrong, and sure enough, by the next day she was back with a new plan. Jake spotted her lurking near the fence with gardening shears in her hand, a determined look on her face. She glanced around, thinking no one was watching, and reached toward the fence again. The second the shears made contact, a loud zap echoed through the yard and Karen shrieked, dropping the tool like it had turned into a live snake. Jake burst out laughing. Karen clutched her hand, looking at the fence like it had personally insulted her. Then with a dramatic flounce she stomped off again. But Jake knew she wasn't done. That evening she sent her husband, Greg. Poor, spineless Greg, who had probably been forced into this by his wife's relentless nagging. Greg stood at the edge of Jake's property looking hesitant. Hey, Jake, he called. Think we could talk? Jake raised an eyebrow. Depends. Is this about your wife's obsession with my backyard? Greg let out a nervous chuckle. Yeah, listen, she's really set on this whole thing. Maybe you could just, let her use the space sometimes. Jake stared at him. Greg, I installed an electric fence to keep her out. Do you really think I'm about to give her permission? Greg sighed. Yeah, that's fair. He turned to leave, but in a cruel twist of fate, his foot got caught on a stray garden hose. He stumbled forward, straight into the fence. The zap wasn't enough to hurt him, but it was enough to make him yelp and fall flat on his face, right into a pile of dog poop. Jake clapped a hand over his mouth to stifle his laughter. Greg groaned, slowly pushing himself up, his face a mix of pain, embarrassment, and regret. I hate this neighborhood, he muttered before trudging away, covered in filth. Jake leaned against his doorframe, watching as Greg disappeared into the night. Karen wasn't going to stop. That much was clear. But Jake wasn't going to stop either. This was his land. And he would defend it, one electrified zap at a time. Jake woke up the next morning half expecting to find Karen standing in his backyard with a construction crew, claiming eminent domain over his property. He wouldn't have put it past her at this point. Instead, the morning was eerily quiet. No shouting, no trespassing, no Greg attempting another negotiation. It should have been a relief, but instead it put Jake on edge. He had learned that silence from Karen wasn't surrender. It was strategy. By mid-afternoon his instincts proved right. A crisp white envelope was taped to his front door. Inside was a typed letter on official-looking stationery, complete with some legal jargon that looked suspiciously like it had been copied and pasted from the internet. At the bottom was Karen's exaggerated signature, underlined 3 times as if that somehow made it more legitimate. Jake read through it twice just to make sure he wasn't hallucinating. She was threatening to sue him for damages, emotional distress, and intentional infliction of harm through hazardous property modifications. She even threw in an accusation of attempted electrocution, just for good measure. Jake couldn't help but laugh. The letter was a masterpiece of delusion. It was so ridiculous that he almost wanted to frame it. Instead, he forwarded it to his lawyer friend Tom, who responded within minutes with nothing but 3 laughing emojis and a single sentence. This is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Still, Jake knew Karen wasn't going to stop there. Sure enough, by the end of the day she was parading around the neighborhood, telling everyone within earshot that she was taking legal action. Some neighbors humored her. Others rolled their eyes. But Jake? He decided it was time to end this once and for all. That evening he set up a new addition to his backyard defense system. Motion-activated sprinklers, perfectly positioned right where Karen loved to place her stolen lawn furniture. He didn't even have to wait long for it to pay off. The very next morning, Karen marched into his yard, dragging a lawn chair behind her. The moment she stepped onto the grass, a jet of ice-cold water shot up from the ground, drenching her from head to toe. The shriek that came out of her was almost musical. She flailed, stumbling back, but the sprinklers had her surrounded. Every step she took triggered another blast of water. Her perfectly styled hair was ruined. Her clothes clung to her in soggy humiliation. She looked like a cat that had been thrown into a bathtub. Jake stood on his porch, sipping his coffee, watching with pure satisfaction as Karen scrambled to escape. He didn't say a word. He just smiled. Karen, of course, was furious. She stormed off, dripping wet, screaming about lawsuits, the Geneva Convention, and something about waterboarding. By the time she reached her house, her rage had hit new heights. That's when she made her biggest mistake. Instead of retreating, instead of finally admitting defeat, she went nuclear. That night, under the cover of darkness, Karen attempted one final act of revenge. Jake's security cameras caught the whole thing. She crept onto his property with a trash bag, looking around like a cartoon villain. Then, with a smug little smirk, she dumped the entire bag of garbage over his fence. Paper, food scraps, even what appeared to be an old hairbrush. It was pettily aggressive. And also incredibly dumb. The second she finished, floodlights flashed on. A loud siren blared through the night. And to top it off, the sprinklers activated again, soaking her for the second time in 24 hours. Karen screamed, slipping on the wet grass, landing right in the mess she had just dumped. She scrambled to her feet, looking like a drowned rat, and that's when the real magic happened. Greg stepped outside. For the first time since this whole thing started, Greg actually looked like a man at the end of his rope. He took one look at Karen, standing in a pile of her own spiteful disaster, and let out the deepest, longest sigh Jake had ever heard. "That's it, Karen," Greg said, rubbing his temples. "I can't do this anymore." Karen froze, blinking at him like he had just spoken another language. "What?" "I said," Greg continued, voice exhausted, "I'm done. I can't live like this. Every day it's something new. A fence, the police, lawsuits, sprinklers, garbage. I mean, Karen, do you even hear yourself?" Karen's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in her life, she didn't seem to have a prepared response. "I moved here because I wanted peace," Greg went on, shaking his head. "And you've turned this whole place into a war zone. Over a backyard you don't even own." Karen turned red. "But Greg." "No," he interrupted. "No, but Greg. I'm leaving." Jake watched in silent shock as Greg turned around, walked back into the house, and emerged 5 minutes later with a packed suitcase. Without another word, he got into his car and drove away. Karen stood there, drenched, speechless, her entire world unraveling in real time. Jake almost felt bad for her. Almost. For the next few weeks, Karen was noticeably quieter. She still scowled at Jake from across the street, but the dramatic antics had stopped. With Greg gone, she had no one left to fuel her schemes. The neighborhood, once terrorized by her self-appointed authority, slowly returned to normal. One day, a real estate sign appeared in her front yard. A week later, she was gone. Jake celebrated with a backyard barbecue, standing on the very land she had once tried to steal. The neighbors who had suffered under Karen's reign came over, sharing stories of their own ridiculous encounters with her. By the time the sun set, Jake leaned back in his chair, taking in the peaceful silence. No more surprise book clubs in his yard. No more fake lawsuits. No more war over a patch of grass. He had won. And best of all, the fence was still standing.